Argentina's economy is booming.
Employed people are eating at soup kitchens because they can't make ends meet. That's why we must protest.
Since 2013, the Argentine economy has not been doing well. Since 2015, as it continues to struggle with growing economic problems, it has suffered a complete collapse due to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Before Milei became president of Argentina, in 2023, the inflation rate was over 100%, with one of the highest inflation rates observed in recent years, and poverty levels reaching almost 40%. Argentina's 18 million people were deeply affected. When you add the 7.6% to 7.7% unemployment rate into the mix, people's living standards have plummeted. The state's external debt averaged $280.75 billion in 2023, and looking ahead to 2022, the $44 billion IMF deal, instead of reducing the country's debt burden, has made things more difficult for the people. So where does Argentina stand now? Did Milei's actions fix the economy? Your help motivates me a lot while making these videos. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel before watching the video. In the early 20th century, Argentina's economy was quite strong. According to estimates, it ranked 10th in the world, with a GDP per capita of $3,797. Today, Argentine economists often ask the question, how did such a strong economy end up in this situation? Because there is no other country that has experienced such a massive economic downturn. At the time, Argentina's economy was strong because its land was so fertile. Huge export revenues from agriculture, livestock, and winemaking made the country rich. In those years, countries could easily buy and sell their own products, and Argentina profited greatly from the system. In addition, the migration of people from Europe to the new America further boosted the economy. When you look at the origins of the peoples who have lived in Argentina for years, you will see that many of them are of European origin. However, after the First World War, the Argentine economy began to collapse in 1914 as countries closed in on themselves, international trade weakened, and the Great Depression of 1929 hit. As you know, Argentina has been marked by military coups throughout its history, and in some coups, soldiers stayed in power for a long time. In a military coup in 1940, a man named Juan Perón managed to come to power through various political maneuvers. Perón's policies and changes would have a profound impact on Argentina's future and leave a deep mark on the country's political economic structure. Perón's populist economic model increased direct state intervention in the economy. Trade unions were strengthened and labor rights were expanded. Large companies such as oil, railways, and telecommunications were nationalized and brought under state control. At the same time, public expenditures and social benefits were increased, aiming to improve the welfare of the population. In short, Perón was able to hold on to power with the people behind him, but while Perón's model worked in the short term, it created problems in the long term. State spending increased and began to spiral out of control. In 1952, inflation and a budget deficit emerged in the Argentine economy. Inflation and budget deficits were caused by insufficient tax revenues and inefficient public investments that became unsustainable in the long run. Perón started printing money to cover the budget deficit. Perhaps the reason why Argentina has such big economic problems today is that for years, they printed money uncontrollably. After 1980, many countries opened their economies to the world, and neoliberal programs were adopted by many countries. Naturally, capital could flow in and out of countries freely. Argentina's economy has been quite volatile. It can grow by 8% one year and shrink by 3% in the next. This has left the country with an unstable economy for years. Constant military coups and political instability have led to high inflation and unemployment rates. Historically, 9 times the Argentine economy has declared bankruptcy, and as a result, there has been a great deal of mistrust of Argentina. In 1989, the budget deficit grew, and the government started printing money to counter it, but it had no good effect. The banks went bankrupt, and the peso depreciated sharply. Annual inflation rose to 3.079%. The situation was such that the prices of products in the markets changed in a few hours, and people started spending as soon as they received their salaries. A year later, hyperinflation was still going on. The annual inflation rate of 2.314% created an even more insecure environment, and investors fled. To counter this, Carlos Menem, with the support of the IMF and the US, began economic reforms. The peso was pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar, and inflation was reduced to zero. Although they were able to prevent it in the short term, the problems persisted in the long term. One of the biggest disadvantages of the fixed exchange rate was that the country was dependent on foreign exchange. So when there was a crisis abroad, direct money was withdrawn from developing countries and investors stopped investing. This led to a decline in exports and an increase in imports. Accordingly, in 2001, the Argentine government declared one of the largest debt defaults in history, around $100 billion. The peso was freed, causing it to depreciate 400% against the dollar. Annual inflation was 41%, and people were unable to withdraw their money from banks, and protests broke out. In 2003, it was decided to break all ties with the IMF. In fact, this is where the IMF got a bad name. Argentina increased public spending and expanded its anti-poverty programs. They stopped borrowing from abroad and started using the reserves of the central bank. Again, these measures were positive in the short run, but negative in the long run. High inflation returned in 2010 as public spending was financed solely by debt and uncontrolled money printing. Mauricio Macri, who came to power in 2015, cut subsidies and deregulated energy and transportation to fix the economy. He received a huge loan of $57 billion from the IMF to revive the economy, but this caused the peso to depreciate as global markets fluctuated in 2018. After 2020, the COVID pandemic increased government spending, pushing up inflation. In 2023, inflation reached 211%, the highest level in 30 years. To summarize briefly, when we look at the history of Argentina, we see that the mistakes made by the government are always the same. What are these? Continuous money printing, borrowing and not paying, inconsistent policies, governments using short-term election-winning strategies, economic decisions being driven by political interests rather than long-term plans, and too much corruption. The people were fed up with these political governments and wanted an alternative, and Javier Milei won the election saying, "We will stop hyperinflation."
Yo, Javier Gerardo Milei.
What changes has Milei been able to make in the past year? One of his biggest promises, to reduce inflation, exploded in his first month. Before Milei, monthly inflation was around 12%, but after he took over, it rose to 25%. And why did this happen? Before Milei, the state controlled everything. I can give examples of things like price controls and capital controls. When you talk about capital controls, ordinary people could not buy and sell dollars as they wanted. Because they couldn't buy and sell dollars as they wanted, inevitably there was a black market. So to reduce the difference between the official exchange rate and the black market rate, Milei devalued the official exchange rate by 50% from 400 pesos to 800 pesos per $1. As you know, the government was spending around $10 to $15 billion on subsidies. In order to reduce this spending, the government made cuts. First of all, it removed energy subsidies, increased public employee salaries below inflation compared to previous periods, reduced public health spending, and cut infrastructure spending. In short, people no longer benefited from the subsidies they used to enjoy in areas such as public transportation, electricity, gas, and water. As a result, Argentina posted a budget surplus for the first time since 2008. From December 2023 to December 2024, we see inflation declining. Since inflation decreased gradually, we can say that Milei has fulfilled his first promise. Perhaps one of Milei's most talked about promises was to close the central bank and switch to the dollar. But switching to the dollar is not as good as it seems, because when a country switches to the dollar, it becomes unable to manage its economic and monetary policies. In short, the country ties itself to the US. But Milei did not do this as soon as he arrived, or rather he could not, because there were not enough dollar reserves. The government needed $40 billion to switch to the dollar, and they started collecting dollars from the market. In order to convince the public a tax amnesty was issued, the government was able to raise $18 billion, so the government is still not ready to switch to the dollar. Another promise was to ensure free market conditions, but as we look at it, if he had done this at the beginning, the economy could have worsened. Accordingly, Milei argued that these controls should be lifted later. As a result of the removal of subsidies and the tightening of market controls, massive protests and strikes broke out across the country in January 2024. Trade unions took a tough stance against the government, demanding wage increases and less austerity. However, President Milei did not give in to the demands and did not back down, saying, "Sacrifices are needed to save the economy." Overall, in this short one-year period, Milei has done well for Argentina. Milei's economic growth plan is briefly as follows: reduce spending, invest, and increase exports. Then gradually the market will recover and the economy will grow. Of course, there is a downside to every good thing. After Milei took office, the poverty rate rose from 49.5% to 52.9%, the highest in 20 years. This was due to factors such as the economic contraction and austerity measures. According to some forecasts, this rate will reach at least 60% of the population by March. According to studies by some universities in Argentina, the poverty rate has fallen to 38%. Official figures will be released by Argentina in late March. When we look at the Argentine economy, we see that over the years it has repeatedly collapsed, tried to recover, only to hit rock bottom again. The main reasons for this are the wrong economic policies, people who want to come to power putting their own interests ahead of the people, the impact of global economic crises, high subsidy expenditures, and the people's struggle against austerity policies. All this has left the Argentine economy unstable and fragile. However, things have started to change since Javier Milei came to power. For example, while annual inflation is at 211.4%, this rate is expected to drop to 23.3% by the end of 2025. Of course, it is impossible for Milei to put Argentina on top economically in a year, but there are already visible signs of improvement compared to the past. Will these policies work in the long run? Will Argentina regain a stable economy after so many years? Only time will tell. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you soon!